Welcome to Book Banter with me, your host, Dianne Burkhart. I hope you will join me every Wednesday as we explore all things to do with, well, books. Let's get on with our show today. Hello, my happy people. Thank you so much for joining us during our holiday break. Season 1 of Book Banter with Dianne Burkhart has already ended, and during our hiatus, we are replaying some of our most popular interviews with fabulous guests that appeared during the first season of our show. We will be picking up Season 2 beginning February 1st. I hope you'll join us. Until then, enjoy this rebroadcast. Hello, my happy people. Thank you so much for joining me today. You are not going to regret it because we have got a fantastic guest who is going to be joining us today and for the next 2 podcasts because she has so much book knowledge. I had to get as much information from her as I possibly could. Her name is Allie Alvis, and she is known throughout the internet as Book Historia. You can find her on many of the social media platforms. Be sure to look for her, and we have links to make it convenient for you in the description of today's podcast. If you love books like we do, you are going to adore this podcast. Please welcome Allie Alvis. Most of the interviews that I'm doing, it's with friends of mine. So the first thing I always have somebody do is explain how we know each other.
Well, many, many moons ago when we both worked at Barnes & Noble in Wichita, Kansas together, it was my first sort of book-adjacent job, and I learned a lot about myself and a lot about books working at Barnes & Noble.
I have to admit, it's like I have admired you since we met at Barnes & Noble, because I remember you telling me how you got your pilot's license when you were a teenager.
More like 20, but
close enough
to a teenager. Yeah, it's being in Kansas, you know, you're sort of adjacent to that sort of thing a lot. And my dad is a pilot, so he sort of encouraged me to go for that. I got my private pilot's license sort of as a lot of casting about to see what I wanted to do with my life. When I graduated high school, I wanted to be a fashion designer.
Oh, wow.
And the first college that I went to, actually, it was for fashion merchandising at the at Indiana University. And that wasn't quite a fit for me. I didn't really like the merchandising. I wanted to do the design. But my first summer out of college, I started taking flight lessons, just sort of as a thing to do. I had a part-time job at the airport and I got a discounted rate, so might as well. And it was really fun. So I explored doing that for a career, but that didn't really pan out. And that's when I ended up at Barnes & Noble.
And then you actually did a lot of work in information technology, didn't you?
Yeah, I did some. I've done some web design. My dad owns a company that does a lot of sort of communications technology. So I've run robots that put chips on computer boards and things
nice.
like that. I have a very diverse background
yeah.
of experiences.
So how do you go from a pilot to computer technology to being a special collections librarian?
I know, yeah, the path is kind of winding. I actually first got put on it at Barnes & Noble when I was stocking some shelves and I came across the linguistics section, which was a field that I had never really heard of or had any experience with. But it was a topic that I had always sort of gravitated to unconsciously. I was interested in why we talk the way we do, why we write the way we do, why we capitalize the letter I in sentences. And no teachers had ever really been able to tell me that in school. But by reading books about linguistics, I got to learn about all that sort of stuff. And I sort of adopted that section at Barnes & Noble as my little pet project. And I bought a lot of books out of it. So when it came time for me to go back to college, I changed my major to linguistics. And I graduated with that as my bachelor's degree with a focus on the historical development of the English language. So that was really what set me on the path to old books.
That was at the University of Kansas, right?
Yes, yeah.
But then you kind of took a different turn with your master's degrees.
Yeah, when I graduated with my linguistics degree, I thought, I don't really know what I want to do with this. Do I want to get a master's in it? Do I want to do field work? I started looking at masters in publishing, and I applied to several schools in that, but sort of as an experiment, I also applied to the University of Edinburgh for their material culture and the history of the book program, which was very different from publishing. But I thought it sounded really interesting. It really aligned with my interests. I'd always had a soft spot for quote unquote old stuff. So I applied for that and I got in.
Yeah, whenever I was reading this on your resume, I didn't even know that's where you had gotten your degree. That was something that I'm very, very jealous of. That has got to have been a fantastic experience.
It really was. And it's funny, I was talking to someone recently and I told them that at the time that I got into that degree and when I was getting settled in at Edinburgh, I had never been in a special collections reading room before.
Oh, wow.
That degree was really my introduction to the whole world of rare books. And it was really one of those occurrences that you hear about sometimes where I walked into the reading room, I saw a rare book, in this case an illuminated manuscript, and it just felt like all of the puzzle pieces fell into place.
And for people who don't know, can you explain what an illuminated manuscript is?
Yeah, so generally when you're thinking of like a beautiful medieval book with all of those colors, you tend to think of the books that are copied by hand by monks in a monastery. That is an illuminated manuscript. A manuscript is different from a printed book in that a manuscript is written by hand. And the clue is really in the word manuscriptus. It comes from literally handwritten. So when I'm talking about medieval manuscripts or manuscripts in general, that always refers to something that somebody wrote out by hand.
Wow, that is so cool. I just learned something new. I had no idea that's actually what the word meant. I mean, I knew what a manuscript was, but I didn't know that's what it literally meant.
I know, yeah. When you look at it in the Latin roots, it's like, oh yeah, this is literally what it says on the tin.
Now, you didn't stop with your degree from the University of Edinburgh. You went on and got more education.
Right. So at the time, that degree was not accredited by CILIP, which is the UK equivalent of the ALA. So technically, I would not have been able to get a librarian job having just graduated from Edinburgh. So I applied for a second master's at the University of Glasgow in information management and digital preservation, and that was CILIP accredited. Of course, I think 2 months after I started that degree, they retroactively accredited the Edinburgh program.
Oh, wow.
But that's fine because Glasgow was also an incredible experience, very different from the experience at Edinburgh. Both of them were incredible in really different ways. Both universities have just spectacular special collections, wonderful holdings of manuscripts and really cool book bindings, and just the depth of their collections is extraordinary. And being able to experience my master's degrees learning about this stuff while actually in the presence of the stuff it's a really valuable experience.
Is that where you fell in love with foraging?
No, forage painting. It was, it was so sort of weird. I'm trying to think of the first time I saw a forage painting.
For those who don't know, what is foraging?
So forage painting, I think you're referring to the art of hidden forages. The forage on a book, it's like if you look at your bookshelf on your wall or next to you at your computer, you're seeing a bunch of spines facing out. So the spine is the back of the book. The foredge is opposite to the spine. It's that long edge where all of the pages are. If you turn your book around from the spine, you have the book block or the text block, which is the chunk of pages. It's that, stack of paper where all the text is. And There is the head of the text block, the foredge of the text block, and the foot of the text block. So when I'm talking about the foredge, I'm talking about that long end of the pages. And hidden foredge painting is an art that arose from people's desires to make books look as cool as humanly possible. And it is done by fanning out that foredge. So that way it kind of looks like a wedge. And then you can paint on that edge. And when you close the book, after the paint is dry, of course, and sort of unfan those edges, you can't really see that painting as well. You can only see it when you refan the edge. And so it's this really cool sort of bibliographic magic trick. And this started being done in the late 18th century. It really caught on in the 19th century. People have been decorating the edges of books since time immemorial with gilt and painting and all sorts of things. But this hidden aspect really caught on in the 19th century.
Yeah, I've seen some of them that you had presented on videos, and some of them are very elaborate. I mean, I knew that they existed, but I had never seen them. They were just fantastic.
Yeah, they're really incredible, and people are still making them.
Really?
There's actually a TikTok account of a young woman who does incredibly detailed foredge paintings. I can't remember her but it's really amazing, and people tend to refer to it as this lost art that nobody does anymore. And there are quite a few people out there that still make hidden foredge paintings. I mean, they're cool. It's one of those things that, like, why would you lose this art? It's amazing, and people want to pay big money for it. So, yeah.
What was the most memorable book that you got to work with when you were at the universities, either Edinburgh or Glasgow?
I think two. So at the University of Edinburgh, the first book that I saw, that illuminated manuscript, I think it was MS2. I think that's the shelf mark. But it's this 3-volume Biblia Historiale, which is a decorated manuscript Bible, and it's very large. It was originally bound in 1 volume, I believe, but it had been rebound into 3 more manageable volumes, because as one big fat book, it was just very difficult to deal with. And seeing that book, it's so funny. I still have my notes from my class that day, and on the top of them I scribbled, "Rebinding illuminated manuscripts?" ? And I ended up writing my master's thesis on that, because I just thought it was so fascinating, the idea of making these old manuscripts usable while respecting their material history and their form and function. Rebinding has always been a fraught practice in the history of books. Some binders would cut off the edges of manuscripts and printed books with no regard for any marginal notes that people of the past had added, or any decorations, because obviously the text was the most important part of the book. And now, understanding what we do about the history of the book and history in general and how people interact with objects, we really want that marginal stuff. We want that evidence of use and how people are cross-referencing things. So we look back at bookbinders of the past and go, oh, shoot, if only they hadn't done this. But, you know, how did we get to that point? Why do we bind books the way we do today? And that was really what triggered my research interest into the binders Douglas Cockrell and Son, who were English bookbinders working in sort of the late 19th century up through the 1980s.
And didn't you even go on to write an article about bookmarks, about the information in the margins?
Oh, yes. Yeah, I've written, I think, a few things about that, and I've spoken about it. There's just really an endless amount of information to be found in the marks people make in books, from, you know, just underlining things like we do today, the equivalent of putting those little sticky flags in the margins, which in the past was drawing a little pointing finger to the passage you found most interesting. Those little fingers are called manicules, which, again, it's one of those fun Latin words that it's like, oh, yeah, it is. Mani, coming from manu, in the same way that manuscript is hand. Mm-hmm. So manicule is little hand.
This is so cool. I'm loving all the stuff that I'm learning from you.
I know, yeah. It's one of those things that when you are... I don't know that I would call myself a generalist per se, but I have more research interests than you can shake a stick at. Mm-hmm. So I can go off on tangents all day.
See, and that's why I like you. Because it's so much fun. I mean, I honestly could talk to you all day. Now, what about from the University of Glasgow? Was there a particular manuscript there that you remember?
Yes. So there I was writing, again, about Douglas Cockrell and Son and their work on rebinding of various books for the University of Glasgow. They did a lot of work for Scottish universities, and they were also very active in training new bookbinders. So I was tracing their sort of lineage of teaching. There's one particular bookbinder, book conservator, book historian named Nicholas Pickwoad, who is just really a titan of the field. And he comes from the Douglas Cockrell and Son bookbinding, book conservation tradition. And he rebound a book called The Hunterian Psalter, which is one of the most incredible books that I've ever seen. It's at the University of Glasgow, and it is a real treasure. It's from the 1200s, and the way that Nicholas Pickwoad rebound it is beautiful. It's in this gorgeous white pigskin. He really tried to emulate the original binding structures. And the thing about modern rebinding and conservation rebinding is an effort to not sort of talk over the book. You're trying to be sensitive to the content. You're not trying to say like, oh, look at this gorgeous binding. You really want the book to be able to stand on its own and for the binding to just work as a support. Mm-hmm. And so this binding by Nicholas Pickwoad is tremendous for that reason. But because this manuscript is so precious, it's a restricted item. And it's rare to find really restricted items in special collections these days. The point of special collections is to provide access to all of these cultural treasures. And so having some things held back because they're fragile or, you know, they've been digitized or whatever, that's not really the point of special collections. But still, some real treasures like the Hunterian Psalter, you have to get special dispensation to look at them because they're like the treasure of that region of the world or of that university. So when they wheeled out the Hunterian Psalter, like it was in its own locked box.
Oh, wow. Which is stored
within the locked vault. And it was kind of a lot of pomp and circumstance, and it was really fun. And it sort of drove home the importance of what I was looking at. And it was really neat. And it's a beautiful book, even aside from the binding.
That is just incredible. I can't even imagine getting to work with something like that. I mean, that has to be a fantastic memory for you.
Yeah, it really is. And it was so funny. A lot of the staff in the reading room and even a couple of the readers were like, what is happening over there? When they wheeled out the special box and everything. Because it's unusual. People work with incredible things every day in special collections. So it was fun and really an incredible experience.
So what was your thesis on at the University of Glasgow?
This was on specifically the work of Douglas Cockrell and Son for the University of Glasgow Special Collections, and just sort of dealing with how that relationship was established, the variety of things that they rebound, and also tracing the history of their practice through their conservation work, which was really fascinating. I got to see some really cool books, and even books that they were in conversation to conserve, but didn't for various reasons. And I thought that was fascinating, this sort of book that was not. But I recently published that in Suave Mechanicals Volume 7, which is an ongoing series about the practice and history and science of bookbinding.
You know, while I'm sitting here listening to this and the things that you've done, I have to admit, I always knew I was a book nerd, but I am even surprised at the level of fangirling that I'm doing over here. Hearing about the books that you've gotten to work with.
Yeah, the world of book history is something that a lot of people take for granted because, you know, a book is a book. It's that thing on the shelf. It has pages. It has covers. You can go to the store and buy one anytime you want, and it's full of text, and you read it, and the end. But, you know, why does a book look like that? Why does it have two covers? Why is it that size? Why is it made of paper and not something else? Why is the text oriented on the page the way it is? Why do we have paragraph breaks? Like, all of these things you can learn through studying the history of the book. And it's funny, I don't really consider myself a reader. I don't read a lot of fiction. I read a lot of books about book history because I'm a nerd. And I read a lot of books about sort of object histories and the history of the significance of diamonds in the world, or wood, or the fingers, or like these weird little niche-y things that people don't really pay attention to in favor of large, sweeping historical narratives about events and things. But looking at these individual objects, you can also understand the sweeping narrative of history in a much more intimate way. You really get a sense of the individuals living through these times and what they were doing and how they were writing and sort of experiencing the world around them. And that's something that I really love about looking at books through this really critical historical lens.
After you finish your second master's degree, you start looking for a job. What was the first job that you got out of college?
So at first, I was not going to get a job out of college. I was going to continue college. I had been accepted into a PhD program at the University of Glasgow.
Oh, wow.
And again, on a whim, very much like applying to the University of Edinburgh, I came across this job posting for the Smithsonian Libraries for their special collections as the library technician. And I thought, might as well see how that goes. It'll be a good experience in applying for a job. So sort of on a whim, I applied to this Smithsonian job. And to my never-ending surprise, they called me back and they said, "Do you want to do an interview?" And I said, yeah. And so I did. And then to my additional surprise, they called me back and they said, "Do you want to do a second interview?" And I said, I'm in Scotland. Can we do this on the computer? And this was before Zoom and before the sort of prevalence of online interviews and things like that.
I didn't realize it was that far back.
Yeah, they did it over Skype and they offered me the job. And my reasoning there was, well, I will always have my research interests in my head, and I was not going to be paid for this PhD. So I would much rather sort of get my foot in the door in terms of my career and actually being reimbursed for the work that I do.
Yeah.
And so I took the Smithsonian job and I picked up and moved to Washington, D.C. I had never been to Washington, D.C. as an adult. I went on a school field trip, I think, in 7th or 8th grade. So this was a very exciting experience for me.
Well, you know, and I have to admit, it's like one of my great sorrows is that I never got to make a trip to Washington, D.C. to see you while you were working at the Smithsonian. I always thought that would have been so cool to drop in and be able to sit there and talk to you about books.
Yeah, it's an incredible place. It's one of those American institutions that the name has so much cachet and you're so aware of it when you're in the spaces and among the collection and interacting with the kinds of researchers that come into the Smithsonian. You're always aware that, like, this is one of the best places in the United States to do this kind of research and to see these kinds of books. The specialties I worked with were natural history rare books and the history of science.
Oh, nice.
So obviously very Smithsonian-y.
Yeah.
But we had a lot of biologists and taxonomists and historians of science and just people who are really at the top of their game coming in and looking at the stuff, and just having conversations with them was incredible. There are endless weird Smithsonian stories I could tell. One of my favorites was we were having a reading room tour of a group from, I can't remember what department they were in. I think it was a group of interns from somewhere in the collections. And the curator who brought them down to sort of shepherd them into the reading room so they could look at some of our treasures brought along this little cup. And I thought, oh, well, we can't have like food or drink in the reading room. You need to leave that here. And before I could even say anything, she plopped it down on the counter, and it had this big, fat, green caterpillar in it. And It was a hornworm. And I think I wasn't sure if it was going to be food for something or if she was currently working on it and just had to come down to this appointment. But she said, "Can you watch this for me?"
So you got to babysit.
And I did. But it was just like, oh, okay. And like, this was a big caterpillar. This is not, little inchworm thing. This is like as big as your thumb, if not bigger. Luckily it had a lid, but it was just a very Smithsonian thing to happen.
I can just see you going home the day. Like, so what did you do at work today, honey? Oh, I babysat a caterpillar.
Yeah. I still have a picture of it on my phone. It was just like, this is the coolest thing to ever happen to me.
That is so wild. So now, what was your favorite book that you dealt with at the Smithsonian? Can you pick just one?
It's hard because the collections are so interesting from so many different angles. You have the natural history angle, which is really a lot of what the people have worked with over the years. Natural history illustrations, trying to pin down species names, depictions of scientific instruments that were in print for the first time, all that sort of thing. But me, a book history sort of material culture person, I was really drawn to the books in interesting bindings and, as we've been talking about, things with a lot of marginalia. So I think I hesitate to call it my favorite, but sort of my baby was a 1490s edition of Pliny the Elder's Natural History. And it had been covered in marginalia. It lived in a Benedictine monastery for a lot of its life in the 15th and 16th centuries, in a library used by a number of monks. And each of them wrote in the margins about the things that they found interesting or the things that they wanted to remember, or cross-referencing this with this other classical source on this topic, but also writing just random notes about stuff. So there's a recipe for wine. There is something talking about how good the waters of this hot spring are for soothing stomach aches. Remembrances of when holy relics came through town and how they got to see them. And it's just, there's so much personality and environment in this book. And it's a really pretty book too. It's what's called an incunable. An incunable is a book published before 1500 or 1501, depending on who you ask. And it's another good old Latin word that means cradle. So this is when printing was in the cradle as a technology. Okay. Gutenberg had only done his experiments with movable type about 40 years before this Pliny was printed. So they were still kind of working out the kinks of what printed books should look like. And it's on this gorgeous paper that's made of linen rag. Books that are made of rag paper tend to survive better than books from the 1980s because linen rag is a very stable substance. Modern paper, which is made of wood pulp, is sort of naturally acidic and kind of decays over time no matter what you do. But rag paper is incredible in the way it survives.
And this shows my nerd level. I just watched a special on how that was made.
Oh, neat. Cool.
Yeah, so I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah.
It was one of those things where I was checking out different videos online and found that, and I sat there for like an hour and watched how to make linen paper.
I know, yeah. It's such a interesting process of like macerating the rags and making sure that it's pulpy, and then, you know, you basically dip a screen door into a vat of slurry and shake it out, and yeah, it's a really cool process.
It is. I was actually surprised how fascinated I was by the whole process.
Yeah, you should watch videos on marbling too. Marbled papers are fascinating to watch.
I have not even heard of that. I'm going to have to definitely check that out. Now, you did not stay as a library technician for the Smithsonian. You also became a reference librarian for them.
Yes, that was, you know, a little promotion, and I just started doing my library technician job sort of in addition to a higher level of work and engagement. Yeah, it was a great opportunity, and I got to work with really cool people and do some really cool stuff.
Now, is this also where you sort of developed your distaste for cotton gloves?
Well, my distaste for cotton gloves started when I first started learning about special collections. Mm-hmm. I was always sort of cotton glove agnostic. I didn't know the right time to use them, so I thought I will just wait around until somebody tells me to use them. And no one ever did.
Well, you know, in movies, if you ever see somebody holding a rare book, they always put on cotton gloves. I mean, it's almost in every movie or TV where that is shown.
Yeah, it's actually mostly incorrect. Mm-hmm. The cotton of the gloves reduces your sense of touch and your dexterity. So you are actually more likely to accidentally tear a page or to let the book slip onto the ground. In addition to the fact that cotton picks up a lot of dust and a lot of just sort of crud. So you can wind up transferring dirt from one book to another by wearing cotton gloves. Instead, most special collections libraries say clean, dry hands. So before we had anybody into the reading room, we would have them wash their hands with soap and water. And we actually had a sink and soap in our staff area. So just wash and dry. And that is really the best way to handle books.
When I was looking through your articles that you had written, and I saw that about there, I was really surprised by the information in that, because I helped pick out some things in the collection that they had at Wichita State University. And the minute that I walked in, they handed me a pair of white gloves.
So it's something that has adapted over time. In the 90s and the 80s, I think, it was much more prevalent in rare books and special collections. And this was partly because price-conscious conservation companies really wanted to sell libraries white gloves. So they said, you know, if you want to be careful with your materials, if you want to make sure that they survive to the next generation, you better make sure that you're wearing these patented white gloves that you can buy from us for $9.99 or whatever.
Yeah, this was back in the 90s.
And so a lot of libraries who are really concerned about preserving their stuff said, yes, I'll take 20 pairs. But science and experiments and studies that have been done by conservators in the intervening years have really shown that, you know, these white gloves are not great for handling. And the amount of oils and other stuff that can be transferred from clean hands is really negligible. Mm-hmm. Obviously, if you have certain skin conditions or different sorts of considerations to be aware of, that should be flexible. But by and large, clean, dry hands will not harm books. Obviously, don't put your finger directly onto the illuminations on an illuminated manuscript. Don't lick your fingers and turn the pages. But generally, you won't hurt a book by touching it with your bare hands.
Now, I was really fascinated. I wanted to know what on earth could have occurred to actually lure you away from working at the Smithsonian, because you didn't stay there.
Well, I knew these couple of cool people who ran this company called Type Punch Matrix, which is a rare book dealer. And during the pandemic, they reached out to me and they said, you know, we really like the work that you do. We really like your tone. We're looking for a rare book cataloger. Would you be interested in applying? And I said, yeah, because rare book selling it's a different beast from rare book librarianship. Mm-hmm. It deals with similar skills, similar stuff, but with enough differences that it was sort of a new challenge for me. So I went to work at Type Punch Matrix, which is based here in DC, actually out in Silver Spring, but DC area. Mm-hmm. And it has been such an incredible experience, and it's so stimulating. When you're working in a special collections library, it's generally a fairly static collection, even if it is big. Mm-hmm. You buy books periodically throughout the year, but you're buying, 10, 20 books maybe if it's a big year. Obviously, different institutions buy different numbers of rare books. But at a rare book seller, it's this constant flow of new books that you've never seen before, or you've only seen once before, or it's a second edition when you've only seen a first edition. And it is just constantly books. And it's such a cool experience. I feel like my depth of knowledge about books as a genre of object has been expanded immensely by working as a rare book seller. You just get so much experience working with stuff that you never thought that you would work with. Everything from 70s pulps of varying quality to artist books with moving parts to horn books, which are fascinating little children's items that are they look like paddles, but they have this alphabet mounted behind a horn window, which is a very thin piece of cow horn. And so they're waterproof and they can't be torn like a book can be torn. So children can do whatever they want with them.
Oh, wow.
And it's just so cool.
Yeah, I'm going to have to look up that and see if I can find a picture of that to add to the description of the podcast so people can see what that looks like.
Yeah, definitely. It's kind of hard to imagine because we don't have an equivalent in the 21st century. It's a paddle with an alphabet on it. It's just very strange. And it's one of those early experiments with making books for a certain purpose, in this case for children, because in the early days, obviously, you didn't have board books. Yeah. Nor did you even consider giving a book to a child because a book would have been expensive. Yeah. You wouldn't let your toddler throw around your first folio or whatever. So it's this changing concept of how children learn and what they should be able to handle. And obviously the horn books and books in general were still something that people with money would have been more likely to own up until the 19th century, when the mechanization of print and book production really got going and books could be made cheaper. But yeah, horn books were for your little middle-class children who didn't warrant a full-sized book.
Thank you for joining us for this rebroadcast of parts 1 and 2 of Allie Alvis's original interview with us from season 1. If you would like to check out the third and final part of her interview, you can find it in episode 25, available on all of our podcast hosting sites. Now don't forget, season 2 begins on February 1st. We hope you'll join us then. And until that time, please go forth and be happy.